The Old Testament historical book of 1 Kings, chapter 21. First Kings, chapter 21, I'll read verses 1 through 14. First Kings 21, verses 1 through 14. If you have that passage, would you say amen? Now Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard in Jezreel beside the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. And after this, Ahab said to Naboth, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it's near my house, and I will give you a better vineyard for it. Or if it seems good to you, I will give you its value in money." But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." And Ahab went into his house vexed and sullen because of what Naboth the Jezreelite had said to him, for he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face and would not eat food. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him, "Why is your spirit so vexed that you eat no food?" And he said to her, "Because I spoke to Naboth the Jezreelite and said to him, 'Give me your vineyard for money, or else, if you please, I will give you another vineyard for it.' And he answered, 'I will not give you my vineyard.' Jezebel, his wife, said to him, 'Do you now govern Israel? Arise and eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite.' So she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the leaders who lived with Naboth in his city. And she wrote in the letters, 'Proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people. And set two worthless men opposite him, and let them bring a charge against him, saying, "You have cursed God and the king." Then take him out and stone him to death." And the men of his city, the elders and the leaders who lived in his city, did as Jezebel had sent word to them. As it was written in the letters that she had sent to them, they proclaimed a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people. And the two worthless men came in and sat opposite him. And the worthless men brought a charge against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, "Naboth cursed God and the king." So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent to Jezebel, saying, "Naboth has been stoned. He is dead." This is the word of the Lord. Not for sale. I've been thinking about this text for several weeks. And it appeared to me early last week that this was the right time. I at first was concerned because I said, "What in the world am I going to say?" And then as the week progressed, I realized I had more than enough to say for one sermon, so be prepared for part 2 next week. First Kings is one of the historical books of the Old Testament, and it's written in a narrative style, and that simply means it's a story. A common acknowledged theme of 1 Kings is the fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. In the beginning of 1 Kings, the author focuses on the messy affairs of King David and progresses toward the fulfillment of prophet Nathan's prophecy that the Lord had indeed promised David a successor to his throne. That successor would be David's son Solomon, who was the product of David's relationship with Bathsheba, which turned into a marriage. She, as you may remember, is the widow of Uriah the Hittite, whom died in battle as David had carefully planned. This text tells us a true story. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's a historical account. An event that took place in the northern part of the nation of Israel called Jezreel. It was an agricultural paradise where the land yielded amazing benefits of fruits and vegetables. Our story finds a man by the name of Naboth who has operated a vineyard in Jezreel, who after inheriting it operated a flourishing vineyard for some time. What a privilege it was to live in Jezreel. It was just gorgeous. The place of Jezreel, and looking, if you happen to be a flat area, but if you happen to be on an elevated plain and could look over the vastness of the lush vegetation growing, it would immediately cause your mind to think, this reminds me of the goodness of God. God did this. Naboth is blessed that he lives in Jezreel and that he has such a plot that is so fruitful, vibrant. The location of Naboth's vineyard must have been ideal, that it likely received just the right amount of sunshine and shade and appropriate rain in order for the land to yield its fruit in great abundance. Anyone who would stroll past, take a Sunday ride or walk, anyone who would stroll by this amazing property would be treated to a visual feast. Just looking at the way God had mightily blessed Naboth's vineyard and what a faithful vine dresser he was. Naboth's going about his daily chores. I don't know if he's trimming the vineyard. The text doesn't tell us that. I don't know if he's pruning. I don't know if he's gathering some grapes. We don't know that. But all we know is that one day he had a visitor. It's the king. That's not normal. But the king visited Naboth, and without much hesitation, he gets right down to his business and says, "Give me your vineyard so I can make a vegetable garden out of it." First of all, it doesn't make practical sense that a vineyard that's so productive, which also means it must have also been quite profitable. Why would you tear down all of this that not only me, but my family has worked to make so productive? Why would you want to tear down all of this to build a vegetable garden? You don't need the best soil to plant a vegetable garden. Then the second reason was that he said, it's near my house. So it's convenient for the king. I don't know why that makes much difference, because it wasn't as if the king was walking to any of his gardens. He would have horses. He would have carriages. He would have camels. He would have several different ways to get to where he was going. But he wanted the convenience of his vegetable garden being near his palace. If you'll do that, I'll give you even a better vineyard for it. Well, the text doesn't say that, but in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if you have a better vineyard than Naboth, why wouldn't you just keep it? And then he said, I'll sweeten the deal. If that doesn't sound like a good deal, I'll pay for it with money if you prefer. Then Naboth would be completely out of the business of being a vineyard keeper. What would he do? He would have money, but he would have no job. He would have no crop to tend. He would have to find other suitable land. He would have to move his family. If the money sounds good to you, I'll give you its value in money. Naboth listened intently as the king's proposal for another property that was supposedly even better than the one Naboth currently had. Plus the king told Naboth again, if he preferred, I'll give you money for it. I didn't realize it until fairly late last night as I was going through this again and thinking, is there something else I'm missing here? And it came to my mind that this text is about choices. And like Naboth, we all must make them. It resonated with me because I find myself in that circumstance right now. You may find yourself in that circumstances of having important choices to make. Many of the circumstances that we face are not circumstances that we asked for, but they still require us to make choices anyway. And the frightening thing about making choices is some choices pay off handsomely, while other choices have devastating consequences. My late father gave me very important advice. Not directly, but indirectly because of an experience that he had and a choice that he made. And I was right there when he made that decision. I clearly remember it. Partly because I was in the middle of my senior year of high school when he announced to us kids that we're moving. Usually, if you're in high school, and particularly your senior year, that's not a convenient time to move. And he was also very considerate and said that there are some friends who said that if you want to stay here and finish high school and graduate with your friends, we'll permit that. Well, I made the decision that I was going with my dad. That was not much of a consideration, although it was very kind of them. But the choice that he made that day kind of haunted him for the rest of his life. He went on to another very fruitful pastorate to the last 18 years of his life. When he died, he was still the senior pastor of that church, but I'll never forget the consequences of that decision. Although Naboth was likely respectful, although the tone, we can't really tell by the words here, the tone that Naboth used in responding to the king. It's kind of like a text message, you have to really be careful how you text because people can't see the expression on your face when you're texting something. They don't know your posture. They don't know your facial expressions. It's hard to read sometimes what people are really saying in a text message. But Naboth probably was very respectful and appreciative of the king's offer, but he declined the king's offer to obtain the vineyard. Well, you don't Politically, it's probably not a wise thing to do. There's no one more powerful than the king. He is sovereign in his kingdom. And it just depends upon the king, whether he wants to hurt you, rather physically, hurt your finances, whether he wants to make life very difficult for you or not. But Naboth didn't appear to be a very political person. He was a farmer. He tended vineyards. He wasn't into all that politics. He just knew that he had an offer and he could make a decision whether he wanted to sell or not sell. He turned the king down. It's not for sale, I'm sorry. Greatly disturbed by Naboth's rejection of his offer, King Ahab returned to his palace and he pouted like a small child. He wouldn't eat. Greatly disturbed, went to his room, laid on his bed, refused to come down for dinner. And hearing that her husband had been turned down by a mere resident of the territory, the queen reminded Ahab he was still the king of Israel. She reminded him who he was. And immediately she sprang into action. Now, we can tell by just passively reading through this text who the aggressive party was in this marriage and who was more passive. Ahab, much more passive. Jezebel, she was the one who drove the train. She began writing letters to the elders and leaders, Naboth's neighbors, that lived in Jezreel with him. She wrote in the letters this: proclaim a fast. Now, she didn't do it in her name. She did it in her husband's name. So she forged the letter, which to her was no big deal. You know anything about Jezebel? She was a wicked woman. She was not above deceit or dishonesty. So she wrote a letter. And in that letter she said, proclaim a fast and set Naboth at the head of the people. And send 2 worthless men of low character, that is. Set them opposite him. Now, one of the things about the work of the enemy is this: don't fool yourself. Satan knows Scripture also. She knew that the Bible clearly teaches that at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word is established. So one person is not sufficient in order to substantiate a claim against Naboth. So she sent 2 men she probably paid. Or if not, she forced them by fear of death that they would lay a charge against Naboth. And here's what you say: you have cursed God, Naboth, and the king, and then I want you to take him out and stone him. What a terrible, terrible thing to do to someone. One man, namely King Ahab, he had everything. One man had everything, but it was worth little. While the other man, Naboth, who everyone thought was less successful, of course, he wasn't on the same level as a king in terms of riches and land and all of that. So he was not on the king's level, the aristocrat's level. He owned less property. But Naboth had a parcel of land the king wanted desperately because, according to any real estate agent, Naboth had this one thing: location, location, location. It was a property of very high value, and it was an expensive parcel of land. One man's decision to try to buy was out of greed and convenience. while Naboth decided not to sell because of a deep conviction. It was a conviction about his heritage. King Ahab's thought was this: anything and everything is for sale. Naboth's conviction was, there are some things you don't sell. We will also discover the difference between what someone might think, or something rather, might cost and what it is worth. What something might cost versus what something is actually worth. Naboth, maybe for a second or two or a minute or two, we don't know how long it took him to make the decision, but I would have to think that by him being a man who honored God, that this thought had to cross his mind. If I do this, what would Yahweh, God, what would God say? Would this be pleasing to God? Naboth must have thought, because God is the one who gave Naboth's family this land in the first place. Some say it could have been in their family for 500 years. And it may have been in their family for centuries, so he does not make this decision lightly. As I walk this land, I'm walking in the footsteps of my great grandfather, grandmother. They worked this land. They invested in this land. They were faithful to this land. This land has been good to our family. We've been able to feed our families well because of the productivity of this land. Naboth recognized the land wasn't just his. First of all, it really was God's land, like everything else. But he also recognized it belonged to a long line of family members, his ancestors also. Did God ever tell us to someday sell this land for the best offer? No. Maybe he went inside the house and asked his wife, would it be a betrayal of God, of the Lord's purpose for giving this land to me to sell it to the unrighteous? She may have answered him. She may have just looked at him and said, you know. And what would that say about how I value the land if I'm willing to just sell it to the highest bidder? For Naboth, is there something more important than the profit he might make from selling the land? For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Matthew 16:26 says. Or what shall a man give in exchange or return for his soul? Would Naboth be considered among his neighbors to be a sellout? Would they want the king to be their neighbor? And turning down the king's proposal, Naboth appears to be a man who valued the right things, such as family and their collective faith. There are two things that connects Naboth to this land. God, who gave it to us, first of all. When several hundred years ago, the Lord gave every tribe in Israel a portion of land, and this is our land. And secondly, what connects me to this property is my family. First, Naboth knew that according to the law of Moses, which the Lord gave to Moses, that is, it would be a violation of the law, and therefore technically illegal for Naboth to sell the land from under the family heritage according to Numbers 36. Also, on the sentimental side of this matter, Naboth must have valued the many prayers that were prayed on the land. If he asked Ahab, do you mind if I take a few minutes to think this over? Or maybe he said, if you don't mind, can I come back tomorrow with my answer? And I can imagine wandering through that beautiful, lush vineyard. And he must have valued the many prayers that had been prayed on that land by his ancestors, as well as himself and his current family. How many prayers have been prayed on this land, and how God has blessed us with this lush, productive, prosperous vineyard. Thanking God for sufficient space to build a family. He thought about his kids running around that property. He thanked God for a life and thought about his life and the ability to work the land. God had given him good health. The vineyard also had become, in a practical way, a valuable source of food, which in return sustained them and others. That's how he made a profit. He may have laughed a little bit when he reminisced about a year when the grapes were so productive they could hardly gather them all in the tubs they used, and bins were overflowing. Surely Naboth realized God had been good to him on that land. Then he also may have thought of the many prayers that were prayed while the family sat around the dinner table, giving thanks to God who had given them a bountiful harvest. Naboth may have also thought back and smiled as he thought about the laughter and the sheer joy of the family experienced being with each other as they told stories of their experiences that day. I could tell you Douglas was our family comedian, and he had us in stitches as we sat at the dinner table every night. Charles Scott would have it no other way that at 5:30 we sat down to eat dinner, no exceptions. The head of the table, Dad sat at the other end, my oldest brother, Bruce. To the left of my dad was my mother. In between my mother and I was Douglas. On the other side was my twin sisters, Lori and Lisa, and then Marcia, closest to Dad. I'll never forget, several years ago, Cynthia and I drove to Springfield, Ohio, and drove past the home that we lived in most of our formative years. Brought back great memories. Naboth is thinking, do I want to start all over? So much time and energy and so many memories have been made here. What am I doing? You must have had to think of the tired yet determined hands that endlessly worked the land, toiling long days and sometimes into the night to have a place to call home. Not just a house, but a home. That takes work. Not just a vineyard, but God's vineyard. It's a place where there had been modest celebrations, childbirths, birthdays, cookouts, weddings, anniversaries, but also a place where his parents and grandparents before him had also celebrated productive crops and lives that too were committed to the honor and respect for the privilege, the joy, and the responsibility of working this highly fertile land that God gave them. It is a common interpretation to say the extreme fertility of that land in Jezreel was symbolic of the blessings of Jehovah. Yahweh, God himself. Can I walk away from this land that God has been so good to? Naboth couldn't sell the land because he was a man who knew that he was merely a steward of the land that was a gift from God as an inheritance that tied him to the land, tied him to Israel, and most importantly, tied him with Israel's God. If he sold it to sell, would seem like he did not truly value God's gift. The vineyard had significant value far beyond the monetary offering, because the land really belonged to God, and Naboth did not have God's permission to sell it. As God's people, we live and strive to obey and please God more than ourselves. And in obediently pleasing God, we no longer strive, but thrive. Along with that is the whole notion that in life there are some things that genuinely hold real value and which we do not frivolously part with. This land then was not only an extremely productive property, but this vineyard was sacred. Sacred because it belonged to God. Naboth was the custodian of the property, a faithful custodian. But God held the title deed. I want to break right here and say to you that your life and my life, it doesn't belong to you. My life does not belong to me, and I'm learning that more every day. I am the caretaker, and you are the caretaker of your life. But God holds the title deed. Our lives belong to God. Naboth needs God's permission to sell that which belongs to God. But God said, obviously, in no uncertain terms, Naboth, you cannot sell my land. If Naboth sold God's land, how would that affect his relationship with God? Because the land represented Naboth's place in the kingdom. The land represented God's covenant with Israel, among whom Naboth himself counted. There was greater implications than just a property deal. God only gave land to the people of Israel in the Bible. There was a sacred trust between Naboth and Yahweh that God gave the land to his parents and who faithfully preserved it over the years, the centuries, and to sell the land would seem like Naboth was ungrateful for God's investment in the land. Yes, God was an investor in that vineyard. He was Naboth's partner. And you know, if you know much about business, that one partner does not have the right to sell the whole business from underneath the other partner. There must be an agreement. God could have asked Naboth these questions if he was wrestling with how to answer King Ahab. If he is asking God these questions, I would assume that Yahweh would ask him a more probing question. Are you dissolving our partnership, Naboth? What does that mean? Are you walking away from me? Are you just walking away from our relationship like it was nothing? All for the sake of money? Am I not enough for you? Have I not been good to you? Has not the land been fruitful and productive and provided for your family? Is this what you want to do? Let me stop here and say, Christian, what do you value? And what are you thinking about selling off at God's expense? Is it your time? Is it your attention? Is it your gifts, God's gifts to us? Is it your love for God? Your work for God? God's church? Conversely, let me say this. What God has given to you and me, well, let me put it in the form of a question. What has God given to you and me that we will not part with? That's not for sale. There has to be some non-negotiables in our life. What are the non-negotiables in your life? Is Christ on top of your list? If not, you turn down that deal Satan is offering you. Are you living your life as if it's up for the highest bid? And what about the fellowship you enjoy with our God? Is that up for sale also? Is it up for sale because of a love interest or a friend or a high-paying job or a career or even a hobby? What about God's peace? What about the joy of the Lord? What about the security we have in knowing we belong to Him and He belongs to us? And what about the eternal hope He gives us in spite of how hopeless this world sometimes seems? And what about contentment, Naboth? What about contentment? When is enough enough? One man's mindset was to satisfy God's will. That's Naboth. While the other party strove to please his own selfish ambition and absolute greed. And what then, anything, would Naboth have gained if he sold God's vineyard? There's no guarantee God would bless the other vineyard like He did this one. God gave him this property for a reason. This is my choice property I'm giving your family as a gift. To walk away from that, there's no guarantee there would be bountiful seasons of productive vineyards. If anything, what would Naboth have gained if he sold God's vineyard? And for King Ahab, the ruthless and jealous king, what he thinks he needs is exactly what he cannot buy, at least legally. And that's contentment. Godliness with contentment, 1 Timothy 6:6, is great gain. Are we living to satisfy God's will for us, God's purpose for you? Or are we living to satisfy our own selfish greed or ambition? Let me close by saying there'll be times when we must evaluate our lives, our choices. What we do and why are we doing it, and what we hope to gain from it. What is God's purpose for me in this world? And how do my decisions or my indecisions affect my life's destiny or God's will? God's purpose for me in this world. God's grace will continue next week. Let's pray. Father,